Congressman Faso, thanks very much. As you're campaigning through the 19th district, tell me, what are the big issues that voters are bringing to your attention?
Main issue is jobs. Employers tell me they have a hard time finding people to work. We're at full employment. We now have a situation in the country where there are more job openings than there are unemployed people. Farmers tell me about the difficulty of getting migrant labor. That's why I've co-sponsored a bill, bipartisan bill, to try to normalize the status of the agricultural labor in the country, create a process whereby they can become normalized and legalized. They have to touch back in their home country every 3 years. But big issue really for all employers is labor, and I hear this over and over. The Main Street businesses are telling me that they're very busy, that people are building, construction is very busy. Let's face it, the economy is growing at more than 4% GDP, which is a striking contrast to where we were a few years ago.
You mentioned wages. If we're in such full employment, why haven't wages risen so far, and what more can be done to encourage employers to actually start paying their workers more?
Well, it is happening, and I think you're seeing a growth in wages now. It's always going to lag behind the economic activity. But I talked to businesses. I toured a sawmill yesterday in Delaware County with, I think they have about 55 workers there, and they're very busy, and there's a real demand and competition for labor. So they've got to pay top dollar to keep people and to attract people. And I'm hearing that all over the place.
How much of an issue has President Trump been so far in this campaign, and what are voters saying about him?
Well, I think that still remains to be seen, but there's no doubt that Democrats are highly motivated because of their opposition to President Trump, and our task on the Republican side is to get our voters out. There's no doubt that President Trump is a big factor in this election. What I point to is the work that I've done in the district, whether it's for veterans, for farmers, for seniors, dealing with the opioid crisis. I just had a major piece of legislation that got through the House, and just the other day the Senate passed it, which is the STOP Act, which is going to thwart the shipment of illegal fentanyl into the United States from China through the U.S. Postal Service. It's kind of remarkable when you think about this. There's another piece of legislation that passed the House, that passed the Senate bill as well, which would try to alert seniors on Medicare to the danger of opioids. About 1 in 3 seniors are being prescribed opioids if they're on Medicare Part D every year. And so the overuse and overprescribing of opioids is one of the contributors to this problem that we have.
Perhaps the vote of yours in Congress that got more attention than any other was your vote in favor of repealing Obamacare in 2017. I'm curious what you're hearing from constituents and if you're still convinced that you made the right choice on that vote.
Well, people are divided on my vote, and it's controversial. I wasn't sent there to avoid controversial issues, but I felt confident that the legislation we had, which protected people who had pre-existing conditions, and which also did a host of other things which I think would have been beneficial, but it failed. So I, as a member of the Problem Solvers Caucus, a bipartisan group in Congress, are focused on how do we deal with this going forward. One party can't change this by themselves. I mean, that's pretty clear from the last year. So I would like to see things such as raising the employer mandate from 50 employees to 500. That would greatly reduce costs for employers and reduce their healthcare premiums. A lot of employers talk to me about the cost of premiums and deductibles. In fact, one employer I met with earlier this week in Ulster County told me that his employees have a good health plan, but they generally have a $5,000 to $7,000 deductible, and that's too much for most middle-class wage earners to pay. So it's all well and good to have insurance, but if you can't use it, it's less good. The other thing that we've talked about is creating a reinsurance system so that we could shield insurers from the cost of very high-cost patients, so that premiums and deductibles could be lowered for everyone, but that the federal-funded reinsurance program at the federal and state levels could then kick in to cover those costs for people that have very high medical bills. And so that's the thing that I think people are most concerned about, the notion that they or someone in their family would have a serious illness which would break the bank.
we're hearing talk that Republicans in Congress may revisit health care in the lame duck after the election. I'm wondering if you've heard the same thing, and if that bill was in front of you again today, would you vote the same way on it?
Well, I have not heard about revisiting the entire issue. I don't think that's going to happen. I prefer to try to deal with this incrementally, as we've proposed with the problem solvers, to try to deal with specific issues. Now, the individual penalty that was imposed on people who did not buy health insurance, that was repealed in the tax bill. But I would like to see, and I supported removal of that because, frankly, it was a big cost for a lot of people. But the key here is a couple of things. One, we have to recognize that demographic trends in the country are largely what's driving healthcare costs because the population is getting older and you have many more people who are consuming more services. Americans also, by our nature, we want the best, and that is not going to change. So we're going to continue to look for the most advanced pharmaceutical products, the most advanced surgical procedures, etc. And all that is part of the system that's baked in. But we also have to try to have the reforms that would bring about more physician's assistants, more primary care physicians, more nurses, people that are able to provide healthcare services to people. I have a rural district. There are a lot of parts in this district where you can't find a psychiatric social worker, for instance, to deal with mental health issues. So there are a lot of issues in the healthcare system that affect cost and availability than just insurance. Oftentimes the providers aren't there.
But I have to ask again, if that same Obamacare repeal bill was in front of you, exact same bill as it was in 2017, today, would you vote for it today?
Absolutely. And the reason is because that legislation went a long way towards reversing the paradigm of the Affordable Care Act, which was to try to federalize and centralize healthcare decision-making in Washington and leaving more discretion to the states where historically insurance has been regulated. And not to say that the states have all done a great job. One of the things that I think would continue, certainly, and it continued in our bill, for instance, the preservation of the notion that people are covered who have a pre-existing condition, not saying that an insurer could drop you because you have a pre-existing condition. Look, Andrew, my own wife had cancer when she was 39 years old. It was a serious, debilitating surgery, major thoracic surgery she had. I would never deny people coverage for pre-existing conditions. We have it in my family, and thousands of other people in this district have it in their families as well.
I'm sorry to hear that your wife went through that. Very glad to hear that she's doing better. I'm curious, though, one of the experiences that so many people with health conditions have gone through is an inaccessibility to health care. Did you and your wife ever have trouble getting coverage after her cancer diagnosis?
No, never did.
Okay. Because so many people have been in that situation where they weren't able to get coverage,
right,
and that precipitated so much of it.
And that's why these protections, which were, again, not everything in the Affordable Care Act was bad. Much of what, for instance, the notion of preserving health care coverage for people with pre-existing conditions was contained in the legislation that we passed in the House. Now, the Democrats will argue, oh, it didn't do it as well as the Affordable Care Act. I would differ, but the fact is we would preserve protections for people with pre-existing conditions.
I want to ask about immigration. You mentioned earlier that farmers that you've been talking to in the district are having trouble finding labor to come help you. You've worked on a solution that would allow visiting workers to come in and codify that. That seems to be somewhat in contrast with the president and with the party's position, reducing, not just trying to stop illegal immigration, but also reducing legal immigration numbers in this country. Are you on board with the president's position on that those numbers should come down?
No. The issue really is, and the president supported a bill that I supported in the House that would have dealt with the so-called 4 pillars of what he announced in his State of the Union address last year, which was border security, getting operational control of the border, dealing with the diversity lottery, which I have not supported. That brings 50,000 people into the country at random, by a random drawing every year. The limits on so-called chain migration. To a certain degree, I agree with that. But also dealing with DACA, the bill that I voted for and which the president announced his support for, would have normalized the status of 1.8 million people who were in that DACA category, and that includes 800,000 who signed up for DACA, but also 1 million who were in the same category but never did sign up. And it would also deal with the issue of the separation of families and children at the border. So that legislation failed in the House because no Democrats would support it, and because the time wasn't right politically for them, and a lot of Republicans got cold feet about it, and they shouldn't have. All of the leadership in the House Republican Conference, however, voted for that legislation, which had those 4 principles in it. Speaker Ryan, Leader McCarthy, and the other leadership all voted for it. The President had announced his support for it, and I think that's the outline of something that could happen in the future. Plus, dealing with the agricultural labor issue, which is a dramatic issue in this district.
You've been in this game a long time. You've run for governor, you've spent time in the State House, you've run for Congress. In all of the different elections that you've been in, I'm curious, what's different in 2018 than you've sensed from people in previous elections?
Well, there's a lot more intensity. There's also a lot more polarization. And one of the things that I've tried to do since I've taken office a year and a half ago is to turn down the volume. So I'm proud to say that I rank number 18 out of 435 for being bipartisan. I think most people in this district, not the extreme partisans on either end, but most people in our district want their representative to actually work with people on the other side. So I do that routinely, and that's why I rank number 18 out of 435. My opponent is enunciating a very polarizing partisan viewpoint, and he would be a partisan, polarizing figure in the House, which would generate as much Republican opposition as Trump does on the Democratic side.
Wouldn't he say the same about you?
I don't think you can, because if you look at number 18 out of 435, that's pretty good evidence that I am someone that works across the aisle.
One of the issues that's gotten the most play so far in this race is your opponent's history as a rapper. You've brought it up. It's come up in a new NRCC ad, and there have been criticisms of you, including from the New York Times, who said that you were race baiting by making that part of the campaign. Your former running mate in 2006, Scott Vanderhoff, when he heard about it, said that doesn't sound like the John Faso I know. What prompted you to make that an issue in this, and do you understand the concerns that people have about that ad and about using that as an issue?
Well, first, those aren't my ads. Second, I would point out that those are his words, and all I've simply said is he authored some very controversial political statements. Remember, he just moved into the district last year. When he votes this November, it'll be the very first congressional election in this district he's ever voted in. Within a week of moving into the district last year, he signed up to register for the congressional race. So he has no record in this district. So I think it's fair game for people to say, are the views that you expressed, the political views you expressed in those words, do you still subscribe to these things that were misogynistic against women, that were anti-police and derogatory of our country? Are those the beliefs that you still subscribe to? And he's never said no.
But again, Congressman, do you understand the criticism or why it's been generated based on your response or use of Mr. Delgado's rap history?
It's fake. I mean, there's nothing racial about it. The fact is that those are his words. It wouldn't matter if it was a rap music or if it was folk music. He authored these words that were hostile to police, hostile to women, hostile to our nation's heritage and history, and I think he's responsible for those words. After all, he has no record in this district.
Well, you're saying he's uncomfortable with America's history, but it's certainly undisputed that slavery was legal when the nation was founded, that many of our founding fathers were slave owners, and that 3 of our first 4 presidents were slave owners as well. Isn't that an aspect of the history of the country that he was focusing on?
These are his words. He should explain whether the political viewpoints he authored then, which was about 9 years ago, are consistent with his viewpoint today. And that's all I've said. He's never explained this. And just as I'm responsible for my words, my votes, he should be responsible for his words as well.
So I'm curious, what do you think is so wrong about Mr. Delgado's comments on that album?
I think it's inconsistent with, it's a skewed view of American history. But I also think that it's his responsibility to say and to explain whether, for instance, the statements he made against police, is that appropriate? Is it appropriate to say that basically when the police show up, that they are worried about you being there because you're going to spit and they're going to do something else, which I can't repeat on a family broadcast. So the words and the vulgarity that he used in the words that he authored, he's responsible for it. He should explain them. And just to accuse someone else of racism is not going to cut it with me.
But Mr. Delgano's comments on race or the history of the country is based on his experience living the black experience in America, something I can't relate to, something you can't relate to. Wouldn't that be where some of these criticisms might come from, that he's simply sharing his view of American history or the United States based on that black experience?
No. What this is he should explain whether he still subscribes to the controversial views that he expressed about women, about police, about our nation's heritage, about the free enterprise system. I could go on. But the fact is that it's his job to explain that, and he's chosen not to.
So I spent the first part of this conversation asking about some issues, and you and I were talking before this interview. I consider you a policy wonk, and I mean that as a compliment. You and I could talk about policies all day. We could talk about healthcare for an hour if we wanted to. Given that, though, and how prevalent race and racial-related issues have become, is this the campaign you wanted when this campaign began?
Well, I didn't bring it up. He brought it up. It's fair game in terms of his record, and he's never explained it. What I talk about in this race is my efforts to deal with opioid addiction, to help veterans and seniors and farmers, my role on the Agriculture Committee. That's what I campaign on. And my efforts to try to help the economy of our country and our state and our district. That's the thing that I'm focused on.
Let me go back to the issues as we begin to wrap up. What's the biggest issue that's impacting the 19th that's not getting any press attention?
Well, I think that it's getting some press attention, but the condition, the dire situation that our dairy farmers are in is not really getting the kind of attention that it deserves. You know, the bumper sticker says no farms, no food. Well, I mean, our dairy farms are in a dire situation right now. The price that they're getting paid is the same price they were getting in 1982. Can you imagine any of us in our own family budget thinking, well, we're going to have to live on what we made in 1982? That's the situation in the dairy industry. And it's a complicated story because consumption has gone down long term. But I'm trying to do things like, for instance, get whole milk back in the school lunch program, which is much more beneficial to children than low-fat milk from a vitamin and nutrients standpoint. Trying to make sure that we have an affirmative trade policy that allows our farmers and our other producers, like apple producers and fruit producers and specialty crops, to be able to export out of the country, but also to make sure that our markets are improving right here at home.
You mentioned the difficulty that dairy farmers and others are having in finding seasonal workers. You talked about the bill that you put through to try to better codify what those foreign workers, what the rules for them would be. But protecting dairy farmers was also one of the key rationales behind the president's tariffs, at least when it comes to Canada, when it came to agricultural products and to dairy. I'm curious, your sense of those tariffs. Do you think they're good? Do you think they'll work? Do you support them?
Well, I have been concerned about the president's approach. I would have preferred that he combat the clear activities by China to steal our intellectual property, to discriminate against our businesses doing business in China, contrary to the WTO that they signed. I would have preferred a more focused attention on that, but the president, to his credit, is giving a lot of time and attention to this, and we are in a bit of a trade tiff with China now. I would just have preferred that we not be in a tiff at the same time with the EU and our friends in Mexico and Canada. But the Mexican agreement is pretty much hashed out. In fact, I'm going to go into a secure room in the Capitol next week and read it. I want to see us get better treatment from Canada for dairy, on the tariff side in particular. So I'm very sympathetic to what the president's aims are here. I'm just concerned about some of the specific collateral damage that I'm seeing to our agricultural producers and our other small manufacturers who are expressing concern to me about the price increases they're getting, for instance, for steel and aluminum.
So it sounds like you're keeping your mind open as to whether you think those tariffs will actually work.
Well, I think the most important thing is that the trade disputes be ended quickly, because the businesses that I talk to that do business abroad or rely upon raw materials or components like steel and aluminum that they use in their own manufacturing segments, they just don't want to have this last very long. They want to see it concluded because they're getting locked in on price guarantees for a product like aluminum that is going to continue to have steep price increases in those raw materials. So they really want to see us get to a conclusion on trade. And I think the administration is hearing that. That is what many of us are saying to the administration. Look, let's make our point. Let's get the best deal we can and conclude these new agreements quickly.
Wanted to ask you about congressional oversight of the president. It's one of the key responsibilities of Congress. It's a constitutional responsibility, and it's a responsibility that a lot of critics of this Congress say Congress, and particularly Republicans in Congress, have abdicated when it comes to President Trump. That besides Russia, where there has been a thorough investigation in the Senate and a less thorough one in the House, but beyond that, there hasn't been a lot of oversight of this president. I'm curious whether you agree with that, whether you think there needs to be more, whether you're pledging to commit to more after the election if reelected.
Yeah, I think we should have more oversight just generally of the administration. That is our role. I would, however, say that on the Russia issue particularly, I've said the Mueller investigation should be allowed to proceed to its normal course. I hope he concludes his investigation soon.
Yes, but putting Russia aside, has there been effective effective amount and quality of oversight of this administration from Congress?
I would point out that the sanctions that Congress has enacted against Russia are very strict against Putin and a lot of his cronies for the really outrageous actions that he and the Secret Service in Russia have taken, the attempted poisoning or the successful poisoning of people in England, for instance. Some of the activities that they continue to undertake in the Ukraine, for instance. These are all areas that are gravely concerning to me, and I think many members on both sides of the aisle in the House and the Senate. So that's why you see stricter sanctions. So the appearances may be that the administration is coddling Putin or trying to go soft on him, but the reality is the administration has gone along with Congress in the imposition of even tougher sanctions on Russia.
But again, putting Russia aside, oversight enough, more needed, should more happen?
I think more should just happen regularly and routinely. Oversight over government spending, over the VA, which is an area which has been a big concern of mine. So I think that the Congress really needs to step up its game, both sides really, and do serious oversight, not just be looking for the headline, but be doing serious oversight over how our tax dollars are spent. And one area where I think we really need better information to the public is the serious financial condition the country faces with the debt and deficits that we're facing going forward. So that's an area where I'm hopeful we can get better public awareness of the financial situation here in our country.
Well, you mentioned the debt and the deficit, yet it's the Republican Trump tax bill that spiked the deficit and is leading us to perhaps $1 trillion this year, something we haven't seen since the heart of the stimulus from the recovery from 2009. Any concerns about making that an issue, considering from whence the deficit came?
Well, there are a couple of things. One, we had to rebuild our defenses, and it required us to eliminate the sequestration, and that was critical to deal with obvious gaps that we had in terms of readiness, in terms of military pay, in terms of things like spare parts. I mean, we had more deaths, 83 last year, in training accidents than we had in combat, which were in the low 20s. So these are the kind of things that really weigh heavily on you. If you're going to have your son or daughter go off into the military, you want to make sure that they're safe and that they have the best training and equipment possible. We had serious problems after the 8 years of the Obama administration and the sequestration. The combination of those things had really affected our ability with our national defense. So we had to address that. The tax cut, and I remember I opposed the tax cut over the SALT issue, but much of that tax cut is having a very beneficial impact upon economic growth. So we have to, getting 4% economic growth is really the condition precedent towards being able to address the obligations that we've made for defense, for seniors, for Social Security, and what have you. But also to get our fiscal house in order. Higher growth means you can more easily close those deficits going forward. But I will be the first to tell you that we still don't have a consensus on either side of the aisle as to how we go forward. And I hope that in the next Congress we can have much more attention and focus to alert the public as to the danger of the debt and what it potentially means to us as a country, as a nation, because it will lower the living standards going forward unless we address it.
Well, but then how would you respond to cynics out there who might be listening and saying, well, this is essentially like having the person who rang up the big credit card bill then lecturing us on spending?
Well, people can be cynical, but that's what my view is. I've been in Congress 18 months, and I think that as a member of the Budget Committee, we really do have to address this, and we have to make sure the public understands it, because that's really the contingent precedent, if you will, for action, because you can't move forward in these areas unless you have the public behind you.
Finally, Congressman, in so many of the races that we're covering around the region, it's a base election. Whoever gets their supporters out to the polls going to win. That seems to be the MO of most of the campaigns. But in the 19th, that may or may not be the case. So what would your best sales pitch be to Democrats and independents out there? Why should they consider John Faso for another term?
Well, for one thing, I have experience. I understand this district. I've lived and worked in this district for more than 35 years, unlike my opponent who barely just showed up. And I have a proven record of ranking 18th out of 435, working across the aisle. I rarely introduce a bill unless I have a Democratic co-sponsor. And I think that's what people want us to do. And I've accomplished some things, like on opioids and on veterans, that I think are important. And we're working really hard for our farmers. So all of those things, I think, are a good reason why I hope I can earn their vote on November 6th.